Hey, what's up everybody? I'm Tommy. So a buddy of mine and his girlfriend asked me to build a farm table for them, and he wanted to help with the job. And I had some other friends who recently completed a remodel, and when they were done with the job, they gave me the scraps. And included in those scraps were these 4x10 beam cutoffs. And so in this video, I'm just going to show you how I went about building this farm table from these 4x10 beams. The first thing we did was we picked the 5 best beams out of the scrap pile. Then we started milling those beams down into smaller pieces. We first cut a 4-inch piece off of each one. That would give us enough to do the legs and have one extra in case we made a mistake. Then we took the remaining 6-inch portions and we started cutting those in half. And that would give us enough to do the 7 planks that would make up the top, the 2 breadboard ends, and all of the aprons. Then we started cutting the boards down to rough length after we picked the best portion of each one of the pieces. Then we started joining, and we didn't stop until we had jointed every single board. Then we planed every single board until it was down to its final thickness. Here I'm just cleaning up this knot that came loose in the process. Even though I didn't get it on video, we cut the boards to width using the table saw. Then we trimmed them down to length using the miter saw. After that, we laid them all out on the workbench and started picking the sides we wanted to show as the top surface for the table. I drew these lines across the top just to help us remember each board's position. Then we chamfered all of the edges that were going to be exposed on the top. This just helps to create some separation between the boards and give it that rustic farm table look. Then we started marking out all the positions for the dowels we were going to use to connect the planks to each other. I disassembled the doweling jig and then scored a line right at the center of the hole we were going to be using for our drill bit. Then I took a piece of masking tape and taped it right along that scored mark at the center of that hole. So the idea here is that we could use that piece of tape to help us line the jig up with the mark we had drawn for the dowel. And it's a little bit tough to see, but you should be able to make it out right here. After that, we just started drilling all of our holes for our dowels. And after all the holes were drilled, we just did a dry fit and assembled the entire tabletop to see if everything looked good. Everything looked fine, so we decided it was time to go ahead and glue everything up. We applied a layer of glue to all the edges and a little bit of glue to each hole that would take a dowel. Then we reassembled the top and started putting the clamps on it. Because the boards were nice and flat, the clamping process went really smoothly, although one board did need a little extra persuasion with a mallet. In the morning, I removed all the clamps and then started cleaning up the squeeze out with a jack plane and a chisel. After that, we checked everything for square and then did one final test with a plate to see if it could sit anywhere on the table and be completely flat. Then I trimmed the ends of the planks with a router just to make sure they were all completely flush with each other. We used dowels to attach the breadboard ends to the planks as well, so we drilled holes in the ends of the boards, and we drilled holes in the breadboards themselves. The one thing we did different is we elongated the holes in the breadboard ends just to allow for a little bit of movement of the wood. I didn't get it on video, but I used a flat file to chamfer the ends of the boards. We jointed 4 pieces of scrap wood to help us make these guides. The idea here is that these guides would prevent the breadboard end from twisting when we clamped it in place. To help further reduce the chance of the breadboard end twisting when we clamped it up, we only did one at a time. After we had the second breadboard end clamped in place and drying, we turned our attention to the legs. First we cut the bottoms, and then we cut them to their final length. After they were all cut to their final length, I marked them for the tapers. Then I cut the tapers using my homemade tapering jig. I actually have a whole video dedicated to this jig. I'll post a link to the video in the comments below. Then I chamfered all 4 of the edges on all 4 of the legs. I did this just to give them a little bit of strength because the sharp edges are really easy to ding. Likewise, I chamfered all of the feet on all of the legs with a flat file. This helps prevent chip out if somebody drags the table across the floor. Then I laid out all of my markings for the mortise holes on the legs. I cut the mortises as best as I could on my drill press with my homemade drill press fence. Then I cleaned up each one of the holes using a flat file. I cut all of the aprons down to their final length and then started laying out the markings for the tenons. Once I had the tenons completely marked up and everything looked good, I started cutting. I cut the tenons by hand because I've had better luck cutting by hand than any other method I've used so far. I rounded the corners of the tenons using a chisel and a flat file. That way I wouldn't have to square up the mortise holes. There was a little bit of trial and error involved here, but I eventually got everything to fit just fine. At that point, since all the pieces were cut, I decided to do a dry fit just to see how everything looked. Then I chamfered all the bottom edges of the aprons. Again, this is just to make them strong since the sharp edges are easy to ding. Then I drilled oversized through holes for the bolts that I was going to use to attach the top to the apron rails. I also counterbored the holes so the bolt heads would be recessed below the surface. We then gave all the base components a thorough sanding. When we were done sanding, we applied glue to the mortise and tenon joints and then started clamping the assembly together. The clamping process was going fine until we turned the assembly over, and that's when we discovered that the legs were out of square. Luckily, they were all bowed outward, and we were actually able to use some string to pull them together and make them square. I cleaned up all the squeeze out that I could, however I wasn't able to get to most of it because clamps were in the way. In the morning, after I removed all the clamps and all the string, I was happy to find that the legs still remained square. I cleaned up the glue I wasn't able to get to the night before. This was a painful and tedious process, but the end result was worth the effort. I placed the top upside down on the workbench and then centered the base on it. Once I was sure it was dead center, I clamped it down. Then I used the same drill bit that I had used to make the through holes for the bolts to mark my positions for the pilot holes I was going to drill. Then I built this jig to help me drill the holes straight and true. I set the depth of my drill bit and then checked to make sure that it wasn't going to go through. To make sure the jig was properly lined up with each mark, I placed this pick through the hole and set it in the actual mark. Then I clamped the jig in place so it couldn't move. Only then would I start drilling the hole. When I finished drilling all the pilot holes, I then threaded each one. In case you're wondering if the threads are strong enough to hold the top and hold the bolts, I performed this test wherein which I found that the grain of the wood actually broke before the threads did. Then I sanded the top all the way up to 220 grit to get it ready for finishing. For the base, we used a pickling or whitewash effect. For the top, we applied a generous coat of Minwax pre-stain wood conditioner, which we followed up with one application of Minwax Early American Stain. We applied 3 coats of lacquer to every surface of the table, including all of the base. And we applied 6 coats of lacquer to the very feet of the legs, just to help them resist absorbing moisture. As expected, the gloss lacquer provided a very shiny finish. To break it up and give it a matte finish, I sanded the top with 400 grit sandpaper and then wiped it down with a damp cloth. At that point, it was time for final assembly. In total, I used 12 bolts, 3 per apron rail, and each bolt was accompanied by a flat washer and a lock washer. And again, the bolt holes were oversized to allow for movement of the wood. I then tightened each bolt snugly by hand. And that was pretty much it for this table build. I'm really happy with how the table turned out. Although I'm not a huge fan of the color scheme that my friends chose for it, I am a huge fan of the general fit and finish of the table. The pieces went together just perfectly, and this table is incredibly strong and sturdy. And again, for that reason, I'm really happy with it. Hey, thanks for watching. I really hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, I hope you have fun building something.